What if Jesus Christ had never been born? What if that night in Bethlehem simply hadn't happened? What if Mary and Joseph had gone their separate ways? What if the star had never shone in the Judean sky? It seems like an absurd question, the kind you ask yourself at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, but wait a minute, because if you really stop to think about it, we're talking about rewriting the last 2,000 years of all humanity. And that's not like changing the ending of a movie. It's like erasing the entire film and starting a completely different trilogy where nobody knows the script. Welcome to another episode of History Would Be Different If, the channel where we take the moments that changed everything and ask, what if nothing had changed? What if the watershed moment in human history had simply dried up? Today, we're going to explore a scenario so disturbing that even the most skeptical historians feel uncomfortable just imagining it. Because we're not just talking about religion here. We're talking about how a single birth in a dirty manger literally reshaped Western civilization and a good part of the planet. So let's go back in time, but not to that starry night everyone knows. Let's go to the night that never happened. To the silence where there should have been angelic songs, to the darkness where a star should have been guiding Persian magi through the desert. Imagine the scene, year zero that was never zero. Bethlehem remains just another irrelevant little town in the middle of nowhere. And Mary? Well, Mary is just another young Jewish woman living under Roman occupation, married to a carpenter, raising normal children whose names no one will ever remember. No angelic annunciations, no miraculous pregnancy, no flight to Egypt. Herod continues massacring children out of his own normal political paranoia, but this time there's no special baby in the middle of the tragedy. It's just another horrible chapter of a mad king that history will forget in 2 generations. Does John the Baptist still exist in this timeline? Perhaps, but without anyone to baptize in the Jordan River, he probably becomes just another eccentric prophet shouting in the desert whom everyone ignores, like those guys you see on the street corner with cardboard signs saying the end is near. The Pharisees and Sadducees continue fighting for religious power. The temple in Jerusalem remains the political and spiritual center of Judaism. And Rome? Rome remains Rome, crushing peoples, levying absurd taxes, and doing that thing empires do best, expanding, dominating, and eventually collapsing under their own weight. But here's the first major twist in this alternate history. Without Christianity emerging in the early centuries, the Roman Empire never finds that ideological glue that will keep it somewhat alive for another 1,000 years in the form of the Byzantine Empire. Constantine, who in our timeline had that famous vision of the cross before battle and converted the entire empire, in this alternate world is just another brutal emperor fighting civil wars, killing rivals, and being forgotten by history books in less than a century. Without that moment of in hoc signo vinces, by this sign you shall conquer, he simply wins or loses like any other Roman general without changing the spiritual course of humanity in the process. So let's consider the chaos that begins to unfold. Without Christianity, the revolutionary idea that all human beings have intrinsic value before God doesn't exist, because the notion that slaves and emperors are equal before the divine simply doesn't arise. The Roman world continues to operate on the old logic where one's value as a person is determined by their social status, their family, their wealth, and that's it. There's no subversive cultural shift that begins in the catacombs among the first Christians and undermines the moral foundations of slavery for centuries. Slavery continues to be seen as a natural part of the social order, like the sky being blue or water being wet. Hospitals, as we know them, forget about it completely, because the Christian idea of caring for the sick and poor as a divine commandment doesn't exist in this world. The Romans had some valedutaria for wounded soldiers, but the notion of creating charitable institutions to care for any sick person, regardless of social status, is a Christian invention that doesn't happen here. So when plagues sweep across Europe in this alternate timeline, and they will sweep because bacteria don't care about religion,
People simply die in even greater numbers because they don't have that network of care that monasteries and religious orders eventually built. And what about universities? They don't exist in the form we know them because it was precisely the Christian monasteries that preserved classical knowledge during the fall of Rome, copying manuscripts by hand for centuries, and later created the first medieval universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Without these centers of learning linked to the Church, Greco-Roman knowledge is lost much more completely when barbarians invade and burn libraries. Perhaps some texts survive in the Islamic world, but transmission to Europe is much more fragmented and time-consuming. Western philosophy takes a completely different turn, and we can't even properly imagine what it would be like, because there's no Augustine trying to reconcile Plato with the scriptures, creating that philosophical synthesis that dominates medieval thought. There's no Thomas Aquinas doing intellectual gymnastics to marry Aristotle with Christian theology in the 13th century, which means that all of scholasticism simply doesn't exist. And that's no small detail, because scholasticism was like the operating system of European thought for entire centuries, and without it running in the background, the entire history of Western philosophy is rewritten with a different source. Now let's talk about art, because if you think the impact is only philosophical and political, you're very mistaken. Forget Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel with that god creating Adam that you've seen in 1,000 memes. Forget Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel with that god creating Adam that you've seen in 1,000 memes. Forget the Pietà with Mary holding the dead Jesus. Forget the David that was actually sculpted for a cathedral. Forget Leonardo da Vinci drawing the Last Supper. Forget Caravaggio using models from the streets of Rome to paint saints and martyrs with that absurd dramatic light of his. Forget Raphael and his Madonnas. Forget El Greco and his elongated and disturbing mystical visions. And it doesn't stop there, it continues. Forget Bach composing over 200 religious cantatas. Forget Handel writing the Messiah that everyone sings at Christmas. Forget Mozart composing his Requiem practically on his deathbed. Forget Beethoven and the Missa Solemnis. Forget practically all Western classical music, because about 80% of it was commissioned, inspired, or financed by the Catholic Church or Christian patrons. The history of music simply takes another path, and we have no idea what that path would have been like. We only know that it would have been radically different and probably much poorer in symphonic and harmonic complexity. Subscribe to the channel because the alternate reality we're building here is going to get increasingly strange and disturbing, and you'll definitely want to see how far this domino effect goes when we start talking about what happens to the Islamic world, to barbaric Europe, and eventually to entire continents that are colonized in completely different ways.
The Islamic world emerges in the 7th century from this alternative reality, but in a way that we can barely recognize, because much of Islamic theology was built in direct dialogue and intense debate with the Christianity that dominated the Middle East at the time. Does Muhammad in this timeline still receive his revelations on Mount Hira? Perhaps, but the message he brings is radically different because it doesn't have Jesus as a recognized and venerated prophet. It doesn't have Mary appearing in the Quran as the only woman mentioned by name. It doesn't have all that Abrahamic continuity that makes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam seem like theological cousins arguing at the dinner table. Without this shared foundation, the Islam that emerges is a completely different religion, with different concepts of paradise, different commandments, and a different relationship with conquered peoples. And what about Islamic expansion into the territories of the former Roman Empire? It still happens because the Persian and Roman empires exhausted each other in endless wars, leaving a gigantic power vacuum waiting to be filled. But without Christianity as a predecessor and ideological competitor, the conquest takes on a completely different form. There isn't that specific tension between two monotheistic religions competing for souls and territories, nor the complex relationships of coexistence and conflict that marked the Middle Ages. Expansion may be faster in some regions because it doesn't encounter organized ideological resistance, or it may be slower because it lacks that element of religious crusade that sometimes motivates armies to do the impossible.
Europe without Christianity is essentially an eternal nightmare of barbarian tribes killing each other indefinitely, because it was literally the Catholic Church that slowly civilized and organized those savage Germanic peoples, brutal Celts, and disorganized Slavs after Rome fell and left an administrative hole the size of a continent. Without the Benedictine monasteries scattered everywhere, copying Latin manuscripts for centuries, preserving not only religious texts, but also Roman agronomy, architecture, law, and classical philosophy, Europe sinks into a much deeper, much longer, and much darker Dark Age. We're talking about centuries of difference here. Perhaps Europe will never emerge from this Dark Age in the same way. Perhaps it will remain that backward and violent continent that everyone ignores, while other civilizations flourish in other parts of the world. Charlemagne, who in our timeline was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in the year 800, inaugurating that strange and codependent partnership between church and state that would define European politics for a millennium. In this alternate world, he's just another Frankish warlord, slightly more successful than the others. Without papal legitimacy, without the mission of spreading Christianity to the pagan Saxons, without that religious fervor mixed with a thirst for adventure and wealth that sent thousands of Europeans marching to their deaths in the Middle Eastern desert for 200 years. But that doesn't mean the Middle East lives in peace and harmony, because the region remains a seething geopolitical cauldron with empires competing for territory, trade routes, and resources. The difference is that without the Christian religious component fueling these wars, the conflicts are perhaps more pragmatic, more focused on economics and strategy than on saving souls or protecting sacred places. Here's where things get really disturbing in a way that will mess with your head. What about the Protestant Reformation? It simply doesn't exist because there's no monolithic Catholic Church to reform. And that means no Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, no explosive moment that splits Europe in two and triggers religious wars that kill a third of Germany's population, no John Calvin establishing those principles about work and prosperity that sociologist Max Weber would later argue were fundamental to the development of modern capitalism. Without the Protestant work ethic, without that idea that material success is a sign of divine grace, capitalism as an economic system might take much longer to take off or take a completely different form. And there's another crucial detail. The Reformation created that literacy explosion in Europe because Protestants insisted that every Christian should read the Bible on their own, without the mediation of priests. So suddenly you have mass motivation to teach peasants to read. Without this religious motivation, popular literacy takes much longer to spread, perhaps centuries longer, and this delays everything that depends on a literate population, from political revolutions to scientific revolutions. Leave a like if you're starting to realize that we're not just talking about religious changes here. We're talking about how practically the entire structure of Western civilization crumbles like a house of cards when you remove one single fundamental piece. Science in this world also takes completely unexpected turns because it was Christian monasteries that funded and enabled much of the initial research for centuries, and now these centers of knowledge simply don't exist in this dark and chaotic timeline.
In this alternate reality, America is still discovered by Europeans because naval technology eventually allows them to cross the Atlantic, but the motivations for this insane journey are purely economic and political, lacking the veneer of a Christian civilizing mission that at least attempted to disguise the raw greed with rhetoric of saving pagan souls. Christopher Columbus, in this timeline, fails to secure funding from the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella because they don't exist as Catholics in this world. So perhaps another navigator will make the voyage decades later. Or perhaps the Chinese will arrive first if the Ming Dynasty hasn't canceled maritime expeditions for entirely different reasons in this jumbled timeline. But let's assume that Europeans eventually cross the ocean and find entire civilizations on the American continents. Without the Jesuit, Franciscan, and Dominican missions scattered throughout the New World, what happens to the indigenous peoples? On the one hand, they don't suffer that specific type of cultural destruction that comes with forced conversion. Their religions aren't systematically suppressed in the name of saving their souls from hell. On the other hand, they also don't have Jesuits like Bartolomé de las Casas defending their human rights before the Spanish crown, passionately arguing that indigenous peoples have souls and cannot be enslaved. So colonization is probably even more brutal and dehumanizing because it doesn't even have that dissenting voice within the colonial system saying that perhaps, just perhaps, massacring entire populations is morally problematic. Indigenous languages in this context are never documented in the way they were because it was Christian missionaries who created the first dictionaries and grammars of languages like Nahuatl, Quechua, Guarani, and hundreds of others, trying to learn these languages to preach more effectively. Without this documentation, when European diseases killed 90% of the native population in the first decades after contact, they took with them linguistic and cultural knowledge that disappeared completely without leaving any trace. It is a different kind of cultural genocide, perhaps even more complete because it doesn't even leave the contradictory records that the missionaries left behind. The United States wasn't founded by Puritan pilgrims fleeing religious persecution in England, because Puritans simply don't exist in this world without the Protestant Reformation. So how was North America colonized? Probably in a way much more similar to South and Central America, with purely extractive goals of sucking up natural resources and sending everything back to Europe. It doesn't have that specific culture of colonists establishing permanent communities with religious ideals of building a city on a hill as a moral example for the rest of the world. This completely changes the cultural DNA of what eventually becomes the greatest power of the 20th century. The idea of manifest destiny that justified American westward expansion, killing and removing native peoples in the process, was heavily laden with Christian religious language about bringing civilization and God to the wild frontiers. Without this specific ideological veneer, American territorial expansion takes a different form, or perhaps doesn't even happen in the same way, and this completely changes the modern geopolitical map. Perhaps the United States will remain a narrow strip of territory on the East Coast, while the West is dominated by other European powers or remains territory of much stronger indigenous nations, having had more time to organize against invaders. The American Constitution and its famous separation of church and state, well, the Founding Fathers were reacting directly to centuries of devastating Christian religious wars in Europe. So without those specific wars, without those tensions between Catholics and Protestants tearing countries apart, the Constitution is written with other priority concerns in mind, perhaps focused more on preventing pure political tyranny than religious tyranny. Or perhaps there isn't even such a revolutionary constitution because the American colonies in that timeline didn't develop that specific culture of religious dissent that ended up generating political dissent as well. Share this video so everyone can see how far the domino effect of a single night that didn't happen can go. Because now we're going to get to the part where human rights as a modern concept begin to crumble along with everything else. The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights have deep philosophical roots in the Christian idea of inherent human dignity, that all are created in the image of God and therefore have intrinsic value that no state can take away. Without this theological foundation being discussed, debated, and refined over 2,000 years, the concept of universal human rights might evolve much more slowly or with completely different emphases, or perhaps take centuries longer to consolidate. The abolitionist movement that ended slavery in the 19th century was largely led by evangelical Christians and Quakers who used powerful biblical arguments against the institution of slavery. William Wilberforce and his group of evangelical reformers in England, the religious abolitionists in the United States, all cited scripture and appealed to the Christian conscience of their contemporaries. Without these specific theological arguments, slavery would likely have lasted for decades or even centuries longer, or been abolished for purely economic reasons when it became less profitable than wage labor, lacking the moral component that made abolitionism a passionate mass movement.
The Industrial Revolution still happens within this timeline because technology eventually evolves when you combine coal, iron, and creative minds trying to solve practical problems. But the social context in which it occurs is radically different and probably far more brutal. Without those social reform movements led by evangelical Christians in Victorian England, who were horrified by the inhumane conditions in factories and mines and began pushing for labor laws, the exploitation of workers, including 5- and 6-year-old children working 16 hours a day, continues unchecked for much longer. There's no Lord Shaftesbury and other religious reformers creating the first laws against child labor, no organized moral pressure that eventually forces the creation of minimum standards of humanity in industrial capitalism. The 2 world wars of the 20th century probably still happen because nationalism, imperialism, and disputes over resources don't need religious motivation to explode into massive violence. But the Holocaust might take a different form because European anti-Semitism was built over centuries on Christian accusations against Jews as Christ killers. Without that specific theological basis of hatred, anti-Semitism still exists because humans always find groups to hate and blame for problems, but perhaps it's based on other justifications, perhaps more purely racial or economic, and that changes how the persecution manifests itself, although it probably doesn't make it any less horrific in practice. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in this alternate world would be completely different because much of the American rhetoric was about defending the Christian nation against atheistic communism. Without this religious dimension, the conflict remains about capitalism versus socialism, democracy versus authoritarianism, but it loses that fervor of moral crusade that made the Cold War so ideologically charged and apocalyptic. Perhaps this makes the conflict less dangerous because it lacks that element of cosmic battle between good and evil, or perhaps it makes it more dangerous because leaders are more pragmatic and less constrained by moral considerations when it comes to pressing nuclear buttons. And what about the modern world, the one we live in now in the 21st century? What would it be like without 2,000 years of Christian influence shaping absolutely everything, from calendars to concepts of personhood, linear time, historical progress, and individual value? The honest truth is that we can hardly imagine it because practically everything we take for granted as natural, as obvious in the West, has direct or indirect roots in that night in Bethlehem that didn't happen in this dark alternative reality. Our sense that history has direction and purpose instead of just being eternal cycles, it comes from Christian eschatology, from the idea that we are walking towards somewhere, towards some meaningful end of times. The modern notion of the individual with inalienable rights, with an inner conscience that must be respected, with a private life separate from public life, it has deep roots in Christian theology regarding the personal relationship with God, individual confession, and the unique and precious soul of each person. Without this intellectual tradition developed over millennia, perhaps modernity would be much more collectivist, much more focused on group and social honor than on individual rights, and this changes everything from political systems to family structure. The very idea that we should have compassion for the weak, the sick, the marginalized of society, instead of seeing them as a useless burden that should be eliminated to strengthen the species. This radical inversion of values that puts the last first is profoundly Christian in origin, and without it, perhaps modern ethics would be much more social Darwinist, much more brutal towards those who cannot compete effectively. It's a disturbing possibility that we prefer not to examine too closely, but in this alternative reality where the night in Bethlehem was just another cold and dark night, this is the prevailing moral norm. So we return to that empty manger, to that stable in Bethlehem where nothing special happened, where there was no singing of angels, no miraculous star, no wise men bringing symbolic gifts. And we realize that sometimes the entire history of humanity can revolve around a single moment, a single birth, a single life that rewrites all the rules about what is possible, about what we are capable of becoming as a species.
Without that moment, without that specific life with those specific teachings about loving enemies and serving instead of dominating and forgiving 70 times 7, the trajectory of Western civilization and eventually global civilization follows much darker, much more violent, much more hopeless paths. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with theology. It's not about being religious or atheist. It's about honestly acknowledging the monumental, undeniable historical impact of a single life that divided time into before and after, that transformed fishermen into revolutionaries, that turned the Roman world upside down, starting in the catacombs and eventually conquering imperial palaces without ever raising a sword. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin in the most unlikely places, in dirty stables, among the rejected and marginalized, and that these revolutions can take centuries to fully blossom, but when they do, they absolutely change everything about how we live, think, and relate to one another. Leave a comment telling us which aspect of this alternate reality impacted you the most. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that will shake you up, and let this final question echo in your mind. Do we truly understand how much we owe to that starry night in Bethlehem, regardless of what we believe about it?